Hello and welcome to Meet the Writers. I'm Georgina Godwin. Bob Dylan is arguably one of the most unique songwriters of our generation and has had many lives with many relationships with women, whether fleeting or lasting, and maybe a secret marriage or two. My next guest has written a personal memoir detailing the relationship between his mother and Dylan in the summer of 1972. And he set out to find the truth. Is Bob Dylan his father? The op-ed piece he wrote, The Silent Type, on possibly being Bob Dylan's son, won the BAFTA New Writing Award and led to the expansion of the piece into an auto-fictional debut novel. Originally from the Hudson Valley, he's lived in Jerusalem, Berlin and the UK. He taught writing and literature seminars and participated in the Penn World Voices Festival of International Literature 3 times. His debut, Boy from the North Country, gives more detail on the possibility of being related to Bob Dylan while reflecting on the relationship between mother and child and the discovery of the truth of his origins. Sam Sussman, welcome to Meet the Writers.
Great pleasure to be with you.
Sam, we met in New York. We had a kind of hilarious evening together at a party. And it was kind of, as you walk in, there's a sort of gasp from people because whether Dylan is your father or not, you are his doppelganger.
I leave that to other people to observe.
But this is something that has dogged you your whole life. I mean, when you were a kid at school, people were going, are you related to Bob Dylan?
The observation has been made many times over the years.
Well, tell me about those times. Let's go back to school and early childhood, because you grew up in what sounds like idyllic surroundings in the Hudson Valley. Describe that place to me.
Yeah, absolutely. I grew up on 14 acres in the woods with my mother and surrounded by animals. We had horses, dogs, rabbits, sheep at a certain point, and my mother had a deep devotion and love for nature and also for art and literature, and many of my earliest memories are of her reading to me and creating the world with her language and giving me that love of literature that I've carried on.
What about father figures? Who's in your life?
Yeah, my mother had many different relationships with different men who came through our lives, and my mother was someone who believed very deeply in love, and that was a lifelong search for her, and she knew how to fall in love like nobody that I have ever known. And so part of the formative experience of growing up as her son would be seeing the great heights and passions of a new man who would come into our lives, and inevitably that figure would sort of pass out and it would be her and I again. And so much of what I've written is about going through the experience of searching for a father figure and ultimately realizing that the center of my relationship to myself is being her son.
And it's beautifully expressed. I cannot stress how much I love this book, how poetic it is, how tragic and also redemptive. I mean, it's a very, very beautiful piece of writing. Those father figures, though, it wasn't always a great experience because you were being abandoned by them. One of them was abusive. They all had problems. Your mother seemed to need to fix people.
Well, she believed very deeply that each of us is capable of healing and transforming, and in her life she'd gone through significant traumas that I write about when she was a younger woman, and I think she believed very deeply that part of being human, being alive, is our ability to transform pain into love, and part of the way that she expressed that, both in her private life and her relationships, but also in her work as a holistic health practitioner, was a commitment to helping other people overcome their struggles. And certainly many of the men who came through our lives had their struggles that she could sometimes help with, but sometimes not carry them all the way across the finish line.
Now, she herself had a pretty traumatic childhood. Tell us more.
Well, my mother was an extraordinarily resilient and strong and independent person, and it was only really when I was an adult that she began opening up to me about the experience of being sexually abused as a child. And part of what I've written about is the experience of that sense of coming into an adult understanding of who your parent is and everything that they have gone through to give what they have given to you. And I think for my mother, she didn't always foreground those experiences. She wanted to be defined by what she loved in life and what she aspired to. And it was only really as an adult that I came to understand that the depth of love that she had to give to me came for her so much through feeling that she had to suffer or struggle toward that love. She deeply needed the intimate relationship that I think she was able to find in the family that she created.
And of course, she changed her whole career because she needed to be able to share that love. She started as an actor and then realised that just wasn't giving enough to the world.
Right, so part of the story that I've written about in Boy from the North Country is her experience as this actress in mid-70s New York performing Chekhov and Ibsen. And part of her journey as an artist was realizing that there was a depth of intimacy and connection with other people that she couldn't find on the stage at a certain point. And there's a description in this book of her playing Hedda Gabler, right? It's an iconic role for her. And she felt after she played that role that Hedda had so much to give her, but Hedda didn't know how to redeem her suffering. Hedda didn't know how to transform her suffering into love. And that was the project of my mother's life. And ultimately she came to the view that she had to find that off the stage.
And so she became this holistic healer. And so she's sitting in your gorgeous kind of Hudson Valley property. And so there were a stream of people coming in and out of your house who would sit there, who would tell her their problems and so on.
Absolutely. And she drew on a wide range of modalities in helping other people. I mean, the notion of holistic health is that our physical and mental and spiritual health is intertwined. Our relationship to ourself drives what we eat, how we relate to exercise. And so if we want our fullest, healthiest lives, we have to integrate our approach to mental and physical health. And so when someone would come to see her for the first time, she'd block off 3 hours and she would just say, "Tell me about your life." And she had training in psychology, and she would say, "Tell me about your relationship to your parents. What are you struggling with in your life now? What is your relationship like with your spouse or your child?" And then she would work out from there.
So let's go back to those school days and a teacher saying to you, "Have you heard of Bob Dylan?" And this started, well, it's meant you went away and found some Dylan music.
Well, I think what's necessary to emphasize about this element of the story is how strange or unlikely all of this was to me. And we had a fairly isolated life in the Hudson Valley. We didn't know people like that. And at first what happened is in school, people started telling me, you really look like this musician. And one teacher in particular drew up his image, and I remember looking over his shoulder and looking at the images and saying, "Oh, that is sort of strange." And then at one point I was in the car with my stepfather and a Dylan song came on. And he said, "Oh, there's a lyric in there about your mother." I said, "What?" That didn't seem to make any sense. And I asked my mom about it, and she didn't want to talk about it at all. And then at another point, my stepfather said, "Oh, they knew each other. They had a relationship." My mom wouldn't acknowledge this. And then very gradually, on her own terms, the story started coming out.
And we'll get to that because there is a defining moment that begins this process. Tell me about your relationship with the music, though, as you were growing up.
Well, the music's extraordinary, and I think like many young people, it gave me an expansive sense of myself. And Dylan, to me, was a figure I could deeply relate to. He had come from a small town in a rural part of the country, and the music for him had led him into a wider life. It had brought him east to New York, where he had come when he was a teenager, not that much older than I was when I was first listening to the music. And I remember I would have my headphones on and be listening to Blonde on Blonde, standing at my bedroom window, looking onto these hills and mountains and thinking, over those hills, over those mountains, there's New York City. And that's everything I have to get to. That's discussions of art, literature, truth, and meaning. And those were not the conversations I was having in the town where I grew up. And I was yearning for something larger. And the music, before I knew, had any sense of a personal connection, the music was the portal to that world. It was that sense of artistic possibility.
So you did get out as soon as you could. Where did you go?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I was 18, left, I spent 1 year at a university in upstate New York and very quickly felt this isn't far enough from home and got to get further afield. And I came to the UK. I came to Oxford, and that was an extraordinary experience of my world opening up, because for the first time in my life, I'm meeting people who've grown up from all around the world and who are brought together by that shared sense that drove me, that desire for something larger than the experiences with which you start out your life. And for me, there was this great intellectual and artistic intensity that I found with my peers, people who just wanted to stay up till 4 a.m. talking about ideas and books. And that was a transformative experience for me.
And you were going to every lecture you could. You were absorbing absolutely everything.
I remember my tutor assigned, the first paper I was assigned, he listed 12 books. And I didn't understand that you were supposed to write on 1 or 2 of those books. So in the first week, I read all 12 of the books, and I wrote him a 23-page paper and sent it to him. He sat me down and in this, classic sort of English way, trying to explain something to an American. He said, you're not really supposed to read the whole list. But no one explained to me that you were only supposed to go to the lectures associated with your course. At Oxford, the lectures are open to any student. That's not how it works at an American university, where you sign up for 4 courses in a term and you only go to those lectures. So there I was, biking across the cobblestone streets, trying to get to absolutely every lecture I could. I mean, there were weeks where I would go to 35 lectures and fill my notebook with absolutely everything I could. And lectures on Kafka and 19th century French history and Hegel. And I inhaled all the ideas that I could.
What were you officially studying?
And I spent that 1 year at Oxford. I went back to the States and finished my undergraduate at Swarthmore College. And then I came back to Oxford for an MPhil in international relations. And then in that period, I then went to Berlin, Jerusalem, and I came back to London. And so that took me into my mid-20s. And that was the point at which, as we'll get to, sort of unexpectedly, my mother became sick. And I then went back to Goshen, the sort of place I'd been trying to get as far away from as I could.
All of this time, you're writing, but you're writing a book that just doesn't come together.
Yeah. Well, rite of passage, right? I mean, there's something strange if your first novel turns out well. I was writing the first drafts of my life. I was trying to come to terms with the experiences that had been formative for me, and I was also trying to understand how to compose a novel. And that was my ambition from the time that I arrived at university. And I think for me, it was not an easy path. I needed years at the desk. What I was also committed to was giving myself the time and the experiences. I think in the States, there's a phrase you'll hear people say, if you want to be a novelist, do an MFA or New York City. Those are the 2 paths, right? But I realized the writers I admired most, they were out in the world. They weren't taking a conventional path. And so I wanted all those experiences of being in those different cities, of coming to a deeper sense of understanding myself. And I mean, I've got stacks and stacks of drafts that went wrong, but all of that led me to, I hope, a draft that went slightly more right, although my mother's painting teacher, who's a figure in this novel, Norman Rabin, he used to say all art is a failure, but the object is to make a worthwhile failure. So I hope that Boy from the North Country is a worthwhile failure.
Well, I think it's a magnificent piece of work, and it begins with your return home to your mother, and she's hidden her illness from you completely. What did you want to convey about your relationship through her decision to conceal that condition?
Well, I think it's something we don't often talk about, how people relate to or handle the news that their life may be ending. And my mother had a terminal cancer diagnosis.
Which you didn't know. You did not know it was terminal.
I did not know. She asked me to come home. She told me that she needed my help going through chemotherapy. We went through that period together, and as anyone knows who has gone through that with a loved one, it can be extraordinarily trying. The chemotherapy was very difficult for her, and I was also 26. It was my first experience of caring for someone through an experience like that, and it was only in the last days of her life that I understood that she was not just sick, but that she was dying. And it was difficult to come to terms with her decision not to tell me. And I think what I've come to understand is that she wanted to live as much as she could. She didn't want us to sit around the house focusing on how little time she might have. She wanted to watch her favorite films and read her favorite poetry and cook her favorite meals. And that's how we spent the last weeks of her life. And it's taken me a long time to understand, but I think in retrospect, that was the more life-affirming choice.
And of course, she knew that she didn't need to go through chemo. She was going to die anyway. And so choosing to do chemo was really just a way of keeping her alive long enough to spend time with you. It was in a very selfless decision, in fact.
It was. She knew that the chemo could not reverse the fact that her cancer was terminal, but it could give her slightly more time. And when I look back on that time now, and those are the most cherished days of my life, and I have tried to honor her deeply in this work, but I can never fully pay tribute to the selflessness of that decision and to the vastness of the love that she gave to me.
So it was during these chemo sessions that she begins to reveal her past life. They sort of read almost like fever dreams, and we slip into her voice, and she tells us about being this young actress in New York and going off to a teacher, an acting teacher, who then recommends she goes to this art master, Rabin, and that's when this man in a trench coat with the wild hair and the glasses walks in.
Sometimes life arranges itself almost in a novelistic manner, and it so happened that the hospital at which my mother was having chemotherapy treatments was right around the corner from the apartment where she had lived.
On
beginning in the
73rd, yeah.
Yes, beginning in the mid-70s, and where she had this period of her life that she had rarely talked to me about. And so very casually, I mean, as if you've gone through chemo, you'll know it's a very boring process in some way. You sit there for 8 hours and the drip begins. And so there we are in her old neighborhood, and she begins to talk and describe this period of her life. And it really is the story of her origins as a person, as an artist. And, right, part of that story is that one day she's in a painting class with Norman Rabin, and in walks Bob Dylan.
And what was the reaction of people in that room?
Well, this was a very intriguing moment in Dylan's career and mythology. You know, so in the mid-60s, after achieving this enormous celebrity, he decides that he has to get away from it all. So he goes up to upstate New York, and he decides he's not going to be a prophet. He's not going to be the leader of his generation. He just wants to make music. And the trouble is that in his view, he doesn't make the work that he wants to. He puts out, I think it's 8 albums in those 7 years, but he's not satisfied with the work. And he's in his early 30s. He's in this moment of artistic crisis. He feels that his best work has been done before he's 25, and he's got to get back to that earlier artistic self. And one day he hears people talking about this painter who seems to understand something about artistic beauty and truth. And Dylan comes into the city to study with Rabin. And later Dylan credits Rabin with leading him into the aesthetic turn that leads to Blood on the Tracks. And that's the period in which his relationship with my mother began. And I focus on the triangle between Dylan, my mother, and Rabin, and what was happening in those months when Dylan is starting to write Blood and getting back to that. Well, he's not getting back to that earlier artistic self. That's part of what I write about. He has to relinquish that desire and come into a more present sense of what his artistic ambitions are in that moment.
Mm-hmm. He's married to Sarah at this point, and the way your mother talks about it, he'll arrive in the middle of the night. He'll leave without really saying very much. He just vanishes. Tell us a little bit more about what that side of the man was about.
Well, I think Dylan is very Dylan-esque in this regard. I mean, part of what she would describe about him is this complete devotion to the work, right? So they would be together in her apartment, and she'd read a poem to him, and he would say, "Oh, that's tremendous. That reminds me of something." And then he'd go pick up the guitar and start fiddling around, or he would go take his notepad and sit in the windowsill, and he'd just be gone for the night. And he was, all of the energy and passion went into that work, and there was nothing else. And this was also a moment of desperation in his creative life, where he was determined to write something that he felt was worthwhile. And their relationship was one of deep creative affinity, and the way she would talk about it, to me, quite romantic, that, you know, he would take a Chekhov play off the shelf and they would act it out together, and they would have this routine of, you know, he would put on an album and then she would put on an album. And I think that the way he expressed almost all of who he is through the music, through art, through the painting that they were doing in that class together.
So why did she change her phone number and just terminate it all?
Because there was nothing beyond the art, because that was always going to be the primary project. And in this creatively intense relationship that they're having through 74, she's performing Hedda Gabler and he's writing Blood. And she has this feeling that when they both triumph artistically, there's going to be a moment of reprieve where they focus on one another. And I mean, as is well documented, Dylan struggles brutally to record Blood in the way that he wants, starts recording in New York in September 74, scratches that work, records most of the tracks again in Minnesota at the end of the year. And when he was finished with that, it was just on to the next work. Right? Norman Rabin, their painting instructor, used to say art as a way of life. And Dylan would repeat this and talk about it. And my mother came to a moment where she realized that that's his truth. That is how he lives. Art as a way of life, not love as a way of life. And she was 20 years old and wanted more for herself than to be and let's be clear, one of many women in the life of a highly acclaimed and vastly talented artist. Mm. She wanted her own life. She wanted her own forms of creative expression, and more profoundly, she wanted love.
So They have this relationship and it's something she's fessed up to, and you now know this. However, this happens years before your birth, so the numbers are just not adding up here.
That's right, and that was part of my teenage experience of sort of something strange is happening here, but I can't quite align it, right? Because first the story is, oh, I never knew him. And then the story is, well, yes, we had a relationship, but don't worry, long, long before your birth. Then the story became, oh, right, but, well, we did start seeing each other again later on. And so they reconnected in the late 80s and onward, and there was a second phase of their relationship. And I think that was a time where each of them was drawn back to this earlier period in their life. And he would talk about when he was studying with Rabin, he often said that he felt blind and Rabin was teaching him how to see. And when they reconnected years later, he said, I'm blind again. And he was seeking once more how to see. And she was in an unsatisfactory marriage. And I think for each of them, there was this sense of being drawn back to this more romantic, youthful period of their life.
Mm. You remember a man coming to visit when you were a child with whom you felt an enormous affinity.
Right, and I write that story in the book. And yeah, there was a day when I was very young when a man came to our house, and it's my only memory of that man appearing in those years of my life.
In the book, the Sam character is actually called Evan. Why do you, how fictionalized, how novelized is it? I mean, it's a different name, and obviously you play slightly with timings and conversations, but how true to fact is this?
Evan is my middle name. And I think when you write a novel, even when you write a memoir, it's a fiction to think that you can get the full truth into it. And Beckett has a great line. He says, you have to find the form that fits the mess. And part of the story that I'm telling in Boy from the North Country is the story of a young man who has to grow out of a fixation with a father he's never known and into a realization that everything he values in himself comes from the mother who raised him. And that's my experience and my journey. And if I'm going to have conviction and integrity in saying that, then I can't rest it on the facticity. I have to give you a form, the novel, that by its nature denies facticity.
Sorry, I don't want to. We've told listeners an awful lot about this book, and I don't want to ruin what for me was the absolutely crucial point of why she did what she did, because I think realizing that and reading her words about why she did it was the absolute key part of the novel, and I don't want to go there, but I do want to ask if you've had any kind of feedback from Dylan experts, from Dylan himself. Do we know if he's read it, from fans and so on?
Well, in terms of Dylan experts, I think there are, I guess it's indecent for a writer to read his own reviews, certainly not on air. But I think what I can say is that Dylan scholars have been excited by the intimacy with which this period of his life is described. Dylan hasn't spoken very much about the period in which he wrote Blood on the Tracks. And this will be the most intimate portrait ever published of the period in which Dylan is going through personal artistic crisis and coming through that with Blood on the Tracks. In terms of Dylan himself reading, I think when I was younger, I felt fixated with the notion of receiving something, some form of affirmation from him. And one of the reasons that those earlier drafts never worked is that I was too concerned with that. But I haven't written this book for Dylan. I've written it for my mother, and it's her whose notions of literature and life and love I have in mind when I write one word after the other. And she can't read this book because she's no longer with us, but I hope that it's her spirit that guides this book.
You wrote it with her beloved dog sitting on your lap.
Lucy is the silent hero of this novel. Lucy was my mother's dog, and she stayed with me after my mother passed away. Lucy, by the end of her life, had lived 6.5 years with my mother and 6.5 years with me, and she was my great champion. And as every writer knows, you're at the desk these long days, and I'm the sort of writer who, if I'm left to my own devices, I'll sit down in the morning and only realize it's evening after the sun has gone down. Lucy would remind me that I needed to take 3 or 4 walks a day and occasionally eat. And this novel could not have been written without the love that she gave me. And I think my mother had a deep and abiding appreciation and love for animals. And that's something that she gave me in life, but she also left me that through Lucy. And it's something I'm extraordinarily grateful for.
And there's one line that you repeat often in the book, and I think it's something that bears repeating again. She used to say that her purpose, is to take the broken piece of the universe and burnish it with love. I feel you completely honoured her memory and totally managed that. We're about to cry. This is crazy. But you have really burnished every word in this book with love. What do you hope people take away from it, apart from sobbing when they finish it?
Well, thank you for saying that. That, to me, is the purpose of this novel. My mother believed that art and literature should be instruments to teach us how to live our lives more fully. And after her death, it was a very difficult period for me, and I thought about how she had related to the struggles that she had gone through in her life. And what she learned how to do was redeem grief and pain with love. And so I've tried to take this experience of being with her at the end of her life and find the beauty and the joy and the love in that experience and more fully in her life. And I hope that other people who are going through grief, who are struggling with whatever they may be struggling with in their life, can find some sense of solace or solidarity or support in the pages of this book.
And whether Dylan is your father or not, we'll leave those answers blowing in the wind. Sam Sussman, thank you very much indeed. The Boy from the North Country is published by Grove Press, and it's out now. You've been listening to Meet the Writers, thanks to the producer, Steph Chungu, who also edits the show. And you can download this programme and previous episodes from our website or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.